It was coming up on Thanksgiving, and I wanted to go to my parents' house. They live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, whereas I had moved to Denver, Colorado for college. I had been meaning to visit them for some time, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity. My Suburban wasn't the most fuel-efficient car, but it was hardy, and it had taken me to other destinations faithfully for 3 years, so I trusted it. It was a 2 to 3 day drive, so I packed a lot of snacks, just in case. When I set off, it was early morning. I knew that if I wanted to get there in a timely fashion, I would have to drive at a steady speed and have a fast route. This meant as few detours as possible unless absolutely necessary. I, unlike many people, have no issues with back roads. They were just roads that people didn't use very often, but were just as valid as others. The first few hours of driving were perfect. The sky was clear and blue. There was just the right amount of traffic, so I didn't feel lonely, but the highway didn't feel crowded. There was a good disbursement of gas stations and rest stops. I stopped 2 times to get snacks and to go to the bathroom. The day went well, but as night fell, things started going wrong. After a while, my route had me go to a back road that looked like it hadn't seen a car since the invention of television. It was getting dark, but I could still make out the road well enough. It was completely overgrown with sapling and bushes growing into the road. There were tall, dark oak trees lining the street, darkening it and shedding black, dead leaves by the side of the road. A light mist hugged the ground, swirling softly as the car passed. I had some misgivings about this route, but the GPS said that it cut 2 hours off of my trip, so I went with it. But just in case, I turned on the radio to calm myself down. The only station I could find was some country music station. As I progressed further along the road, I noticed some odd things along the side of it. First I saw was a pile of what looked like garbage. As I got closer, I saw that it was a bundle of dirty, ratty clothes and empty cans, sopping over with some unknown rotting fluid, and some fleshy mounds. I can't say for certain, but I thought that I saw something underneath them moving as I drove by. As night fell, the mist grew thicker and some dark, ominous cloud started rolling in. I worried a little bit about rain, but it never came. The clouds just kind of hovered, darkening the path even further. The radio started to cut in and out, changing rapidly from static to this faint station that I couldn't recognize. It had what sounded like chanting and shrieking. I quickly turned it off. My heart was thumping in my ears. Without the music to distract me from my surroundings, I began to notice more odd things along the side of the road. I passed heaps of garbage that looked like they'd been there for centuries. They were covered with what looked like black goo. There were overgrown overshoots of the road that no doubt led to long abandoned farmsteads. On one of these, there were objects swinging from the trees that lined the entrance. I told myself that they were just oddly shaped hanging vines or a trick of the light. There's no way they could have been bodies. There was the rotted out carcass of an old wooden church, just off the side. The roof had collapsed, most of the remaining walls had at least a quarter of the boards missing. It was covered in vines and overgrowth. Through the gaping hole that used to be the doors, I can see the pews that were strewn across wildly like some great force had came through and swept them aside in a fit of violence. There were also piles in front of it that trailed partially onto the road. I slowed down and drove carefully around them. I couldn't tell what they were, but it didn't seem very good. At this point, I was thoroughly creeped out, and I was seriously considering just turning around and leaving, shortcut or not, when I saw there was a massive downed tree laying in the road. I consulted the GPS, which told me that there was a side route about half a mile back that would connect me back to the road after a while. I thought it over for a while and decided that I'd give it a try. I thought, hey, what's the worst that can happen? If the road got too bad, I could just turn back around. It took me a while to find it, seeing as it was so overgrown. I didn't even think it could be called a road. There was knee-high grass all over the narrow place, and years of nuance had been erased, and years of non-use had erased any track or ruts that may have been there. It was pretty narrow, just enough room for one car, and then 2 ditches on either side of the road. Luckily, there weren't too many bushes, so it was easy enough to drive on. Off to the sides, there were what I assumed to be remnants of what used to be a civilization. There were piles of decayed planks of wood. There were also a few rusted out hunks of old car. Some of them looked like they'd been abandoned on the side of the road, like their owners just pulled over, gotten out, and left. Others were less rusted. Looked like they'd been in high-speed accidents. Those were bent around trees, smashed into other rusted skeletons, or just laying totaled at the side of the ditch by the road. There was one noticeable car that stuck out because it had flipped onto its nose against a tree, so that the roof was parallel with the tree trunk. Throughout the period where I was observing all of this, there was movement out of the forest. The mist obscured my view more than 2 feet into the forest, but I could make out shapes that swirled the mist. Whenever I thought I might make out a feature, it would dart back into the mist, leaving with nothing but swirling and a cold sinking feeling in my abdomen. Eventually, I decided to turn back. The road was getting progressively worse. My GPS was showing nothing but forest now, and I was beyond tired. The sides of the road were almost completely blackened by the forest, so I drove forward, looking for a place to turn around. After about a mile, I reached what looked like a town, although I don't think anyone has lived there for at least a century. There were a few buildings on either side of the road, all overgrown to the point to where you could barely tell there was buildings there. A section of 2 or 3 buildings were just completely burnt. The house next to that was in extremely good shape. It was overgrown, but it looked almost entirely intact. I'm a very curious person. I always have been, so I took this opportunity that I just couldn't miss. I decided to investigate, despite that nagging feeling of fright. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out. I walked around to the trunk and grabbed my flashlight. As I walked towards the building, I realized that it was in even better shape than I thought. The boards were barely rotted and all the windows were completely intact. I walked over, put my hand out to open the door when a wave of apprehension and fear just washed over me. I jerked my hand back and stumbled backwards a bit. I decided to leave as quickly as I could and started walking back to my car. I glanced over at my passenger side window and froze. There was a reflection in the window. I saw my own, and behind me on the porch of the house, a tall, pale figure. It had long, hollow eye sockets, and its mouth was stretched in an eternal scream, with massive crooked teeth sticking out of this void. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity, frozen in place. Then it dashed towards me, and the spell was broken. I sprinted to the car. I ripped open the passenger side door, dove in, slammed it shut. The thing rushed towards my car as I scrambled backwards into the driver's seat. It reached my car and began to claw at the doors with what I assumed were claws. It shrieked in an unearthly howl, louder than I thought physically possible. I clamped my hands over my ears and managed to get into the driver's seat. I fumbled with my keys and then got the car started. As it rumbled to life, the creature stepped back and shrieked even louder. A chorus of disjointed screams erupted from the surrounding forests and town. As I changed gears, I saw more of those things sprinting out of other buildings and out of the blanket of mist that had surrounded me. I jammed the gas pedal to the ground and my car jumped forward speedily. I quickly spun around and saw more of those things rushing from the building. A few of them reached my car and began to gouge it, making a hellacious combination of shrieks and screaming and their claws on the middle of my car. I began speeding down the road, frantically trying to push the gas pedal down even more despite the fact that it was already floored. I looked down the road, seeing more of these things rushing down at me out of the mist. After this, things get a little fuzzy. My memories from this point on are like sparse beams of light in a dark room. The next thing I remember is passing a car that was flipped into a tree. The front of my car severely dented, and there was a black ooze all over my hood. The windshield splattered with it as well, and my heart was beating 1,000 times a minute. I was covered in sweat and I was panting and gasping for air. I can hear the shrieks not too far behind, and I still had the pedal floored. The speedometer said that I was going 90. I looked at the passenger side window and saw one of those things gliding along me. Then my memory stopped again. After that, I remember driving at full throttle around a turn and going up on one wheel, almost flipping over, somehow managing to steady myself. I raced down the road, listening for any signs of those creatures. There were a few far-off shrieks, but nothing close by. My pulse pounding as I was drenched in sweat, I noticed in my peripheral vision 2 things. 1, that the mist had cleared, and 2, that I was near that rotting church. As I sped towards it, time seemed to slow down. My eyes widened in horror as I came to the realization that I had forgotten the piles in the road. My foot slammed onto the brakes, but it was too late. I slammed into a clump, and I was thrown forward into my airbag. As I fell into the pit of unconsciousness, the shrieks of creatures followed me. When I awoke sometime later, the first thing I noticed was that it was light out. My head throbbed and I was covered in scratches. My body felt like it had been through an industrial wood chipper. I sat up slowly, groaning in pain as I saw that I was laying on the pavement surrounded by millions of shards of glass that used to be my windshield. I looked over and saw the smoking wreck that used to be my car. It looked like when I crashed it, I'd been thrown out the window. It was a complete miracle I survived. I got up and limped slowly to my car. From the outside, the claw marks were even worse than I thought. There were 3 parallel lines that scratched for about 3 feet down and across. They were all 3 inches deep, and many just slightly pierced through the door. I shuddered, realizing how close I had come to death. I looked around me, wondering how to proceed. I was in the middle of the woods on an abandoned road with no car, injured, no shelter, and possibly going to be hunted down by those things. I thought about it for a while and then started walking down the road back towards the highway. It was quite a ways away, probably about a day-and-a-half walk, but I knew it was my only chance. After hours of walking, my legs were nearly numb. I was dehydrated and hungry, and it seemed like salvation was still miles away. I stopped off to the side and collapsed into an old rotting trunk. I leaned my back against a tree and closed my eyes, wiping sweat from my brow. I breathed a sigh and settled back into the tree and letting my thoughts just wander. I awoke with a start, my heart racing. I shot up, noticing that it was nighttime once again. The temperature had dropped down to 20 degrees. I cursed myself for falling asleep and trudged back onto the road, the stars providing a very dim light as I began to walk again. That's when I heard it. The far-off shriek of one of those things. My eyes widened and I stood up completely, trying to pinpoint its location. The next shriek I heard was louder, and it came from the direction of my car down the road. I turned and sprinted in the other direction, adrenaline flooding my system. A dense fog soon materialized around me, limiting my vision to about 10 feet around. Occasionally I'd hear those shrieks from behind me, and they were getting louder each time. I could hear more screams from behind me. I was slowing down, which was something I couldn't afford. I picked up the pace a little. I began sobbing, realizing that the odds of me escaping this was almost 0. I was lost in my thoughts as I didn't notice a small divot in the road. My foot slipped into it and I violently fell, hearing something in my ankle snap as I hit the ground. A jolt of pain shot up my leg and I screamed in agony. I looked down at my ankle, wiping tears of terror and agony from my eyes. I checked my ankle. It was almost twisted completely to the side, so that my toes were pointed at my arm. My vision swam for a second and I felt really lightheaded. Clamped my eyes shut and bit the inside of my cheek as hard as I could. It hurt like hell, but it helped clear my head. I glanced down at my ankle and I let out another yell of frustration and pain. My shout was answered by a scream down the road, reminding me of my situation. I dragged myself to the side of the road, rolling myself into a ditch. I cried out in pain as I hit my ankle, my vision dizzying, as I attempted to stay conscious. I stifled my cries as I heard that scream grow closer to me, maybe a quarter of a mile. I scooped some leaves from around me, trying to move my leg as little as possible. Due to the amount of leaves, I was almost able to completely bury myself in them. I left a small slit on my face so that I can partially see onto the road. As the shrieking grew closer, my body started to tremble. I tried to stifle those sounds as the creatures grew closer. My eyes glued to the wall of the fog that loomed over the road. An ear-deafening shriek erupted, making me flinch. One of those creatures glided out of the fog, its horrific mouth stretched into a grin. Its teeth poked out from its mouth at all different angles. It slowed to a stop and surveyed the surrounding fog with its empty sockets. I held my breath, my pulse beating in my ears. It stayed for a while, then glided on, the mist swirling in its wake. It felt as if an eternity had passed. An eternity filled with procession of all of them. Some stopping like the first, some gliding past without slowing down at all. There were so many of them, and I began noticing occasional differences. Some wore nothing, while others had ratted tatters of clothes. Some trailed down their elonged faces, and they just made me sick. Eventually, the flow of those creatures ebbed and then stopped. After about 30 minutes of no movement, I slowly sat up and looked around. I grabbed a nearby stick and used it as a crutch. I propped myself up and began limping toward the road. I started to follow my original path, but slower this time, as to not attract those things. As night dragged on, I began feeling more confident. I hadn't heard anything for about an hour, and I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the highway by morning. And I was right. In fact, I made it to the offshoot that I had gotten out from the highway before it even started getting light. As I set foot onto the pavement, I let out an excited whoop and waved my makeshift crutch in the air. I laughed and began walking down the paved road when suddenly I stopped. The mist was clearing, so I had a better view down the road, and I saw them. They were in a row that stretched across the street. As I stared at them in shock, they began gliding toward me slowly. I yelled and quickly turned into a run when I was stopped. Behind me, another line of them. They were gliding towards me slowly, advancing toward me so silently. My legs had felt like jello, and I just sank to the ground in despair. I sat down on the pavement and stared helplessly as they began sprinting toward me, and their shrieks from them filled the air. I cried out in agony as their claws pierced my body and ripped me apart. A few months later, another person came down the road. He checked his GPS because he was suspicious about the road. It was really overgrown, and there were what looked like animal bones scattered across the road. His GPS said it was a shortcut, and he ventured forward, looking forward to surprising his friends for Christmas. He had gone to visit his friend's parents' house a few months ago, so he should be really surprised. He chuckled as he imagined his shocked face, driving over the bones without a second thought. Hey ghouls, I hope you enjoyed this New Mexico creepypasta. I'm sorry if you hear weird noises. My dog is playing with a bone and she keeps dropping it and throwing it around. So if you hear that in the background, that's what it is. How was your ghouls' New Year's Eve and New Year's Day? Our New Year's Eve consisted of playing old people board games with our other couple friends, and it was fun, actually, like a lot of fun. I honestly was like, oh, we're probably gonna leave early. We didn't leave until after midnight. It was ridiculous. So what did you ghouls do for New Year's? I'm curious. Did you drink? Did you party? Did you just sit there and watch the ball drop? Let me know in the comments. But as always, ghouls, the last video will be on the top left. The last video will be on the bottom left. All my social medias are on the screen as well as in the description box below. And remember, there's always someone or something watching you.